Never before have so many of the world's billionaires collected art, especially contemporary art. And never before have we seen art collectors have such a strong desire to build private museums within their lifetimes to display their dazzling collections. Meanwhile, many public institutions are on the brink of collapse. In today's episode of Billionaires Playground, we talk to Georgina Adam, author of The Rise and the Rise of the Private Art Museum, about what happens to the art market when today's museums no longer have financial viability and when the collections reach the market. Georgina Adam, you are undoubtedly the grand lady of the art and auction market. After spending more than 30 years writing about art and the art and auction market, as editor for the market sector of the art newspaper, writing weekly column in Financial Times, authored to at least 3 books, and by now, as well as a very appreciated moderator and panelist, I feel compelled to ask, what has been most fun?
Gosh, now I didn't expect that question, but let's have a stab at it. I think all of it's been wonderful, actually. I think I've had a fascinating time following the art market, and particularly following the ups and downs of the art market, seeing us going through the global financial crisis of 2008, watching particularly the change in taste, and that was in the past was a move away from antiques, old art, towards more contemporary art. And now, of course, I'm looking at things like NFTs, digital art, and a whole young generation coming up with very different aims and very different tastes in the art world.
How come you started to write about art?
Well, it was a bit of an accident, really. In fact, my whole career, if you can call it such, has been an accident. It's sort of one thing led to another. I was in Paris. My sister was the editor of a small arts magazine. She said, could you send me some articles about culture in Paris? I did. Then somebody else called me and said, oh, we'd like some articles from Paris. Then we moved to London. So in London, obviously, I continued. Then we moved to Japan. And believe me, nobody can afford to send a cultural journalist to Japan. So all of a sudden, I was able to write about art, the art market from Japan for 5 years. That was very interesting and instructive. Then we moved.
What period was this?
It was in the late 90s.
Okay.
So it was after the end of the bubble period. And then in 2000 came back to London and have continued on. I think what was interesting was I was a journalist for so long, but journalism inevitably is quite transient. You write it today, it's read tomorrow, and it's quite frankly in the dustbin the day after. And the reason that I wanted to write about the art market was because I had seen so much and I wanted to put it down and have it consigned. So that's why I wrote Big Bucks, which was the transformation of the art market in the 21st century, because I'd seen such changes in taste, but also changes in how auction houses operated, changes in how galleries worked, the arrival of new economies, particularly China, India, Russia. So I really wanted to do more than just write short articles about it. And that's what I did. And then I saw with the boom in the art market, I wrote about that in Dark Side of the Boom because I saw a lot of things going wrong in a way. And then I embarked on a new project, which is to write about another phenomenon of the 21st century, because I'm very interested in the intersection of art and money, obviously. And this phenomenon is private museums. So I was intending to write a book, I had already done a bit of research, but I was intending to write a much longer book. But then, of course, COVID came along. And so the book that I finally wrote was based on the research I had already done.
Because you wanted to release it. Because you wanted to release it.
I think also because my publisher wanted to release it.
Yeah.
They'd already paid me in advance.
That's a good reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we made the decision, and it forms part of a series called Hot Topics in the Art World, and they're short books. So it is not as long as the book I had originally intended, but actually I think sometimes short is not bad. Yeah. You boil down everything to the essential.
Kill your darlings. Well, maybe we will have a part 2 then. So I would say it's always a balance to write about the art markets, because if you're to be credible, the risk is that you do not make everyone happy, and that some of your previous friends actually can become your enemies. Do you find it hard to find the balance?
It's interesting because a lot of people have asked me that question. Didn't I alienate anybody? And really, I think I was very lucky. For a start, in my interviews, I always checked back with people. There's no interview in any book that has not been checked back with the interviewee. So they knew what I was going to write. And I don't think anybody has actually ceased to talk to me, and I certainly have received no threats of lawsuits. Well, one, but it wasn't very serious. So I've managed to, I think, strike a balance. And I think that one does have to strike a balance, because you can't say the art market is perfect. You can't say it's all evil as well, because that would be untrue. Unfortunately, the cases of wrongdoing tend to get more prominence, because obviously it's more interesting than something that's working. And I think that it's important to emphasize that there is a perfectly healthy, above-board art market, as well as these excesses that I discuss in my second book.
We will soon talk about your latest book, The Rise and Rise of the Private Art Museums. But before that, I would like to start with one of your previous books, as you mentioned, The Dark Side of the Boom. What does the title stand for?
Well, the whole thing, of course, goes back to Pink Floyd, which is my generation. Let's forget that I'm a baby boomer, and The Dark Side of the Moon. And the last chapter in my first book was called The Dark Side of the Moon, which did touch on some of these topics. And so when I came to write the second one, I came up with this title, The Dark Side of the Boom, because the art market had been booming, and in its wake it had brought excesses. Those excesses are still there. It's not the whole market, but I felt that it was important to write about it, and I don't think anybody else has really quite written about that.
When reading your books, it's obvious that art for many today is a new currency. What is your attitude to art after all these years, and how did the art market change?
Yes, I'm rather saddened by this fact that art has become an asset class. I really am, because particularly at the very top end, it's sort of become a billionaire's blood sport, really, hasn't it? You know, buying the most expensive works of art, you know, vying it out against other billionaires to buy the top works. And I think that it's very often an investment decision. Some go into private museums, we'll talk about them later. An awful lot go into free ports, and that's rather sad.
Yeah. So the art market has become a playground for the rich a bit.
The top end of the art market has become a playground for the rich. But let's forget, the top end is only a small part. It hits the headlines, but there's another art market going on underneath, which is just fine.
True. Back to the dark side of the boom. In the prologue, you write about the opening of the free port in Luxembourg, often associated with the Swiss businessman Yves Bouvier, that was arrested in Monaco, accused of fraud by the Russian businessman and billionaire Dmitry Rybolovlev.
I think.
You insinuate that the existence of the impregnable palace Freeport, which contains art, antiques, diamonds and wine, collections for multi-billion sums, is a way to hide dirty money and money laundering. To be honest, is not the lack of transparency an important ingredient to keep the art market's machinery going?
Yes, I'm afraid that lack of transparency, I'm afraid the opacity of the art market is an element that can lead to wrongdoing. Art is portable, it's actually quite difficult to value. And I mean, a brilliant example is Salvador Mundi. Estimated at 100, sells for 450. So how can you estimate the value of a work of art until two people actually duke it out in an auction room? So I think this makes it difficult, because how can a customs person looking at a shipment know whether the value declared is the true value or another one? And this was used in the past for a Basquiat, which was used in money laundering, and the value declared was $100, and actually it sold at auction in London a few years later for about 6 or 7 million. So there's definitely, and the fact that it's still quite personal. People still make deals pretty well on a handshake, although less than in the past, because the sums involved are so huge now. But I quote somebody, I think in the second book, saying you would never buy a house without doing your due diligence, and you'd have a surveyor around who'll look at absolutely everything, and yet people will still buy a painting without really looking closely at the forensic side of it, looking at the provenance, and looking at the prices. After all, Rybolovlev bought all of these works through Yves Bouvier without apparently having ever looked at the prices for comparable works, which seems astonishing to spend that much money.
Especially when you come back afterwards saying that you feel, fraud.
You're completely defrauded, yes.
Do you think we will ever have total transparency? And will NFT be the way to solve it, you think?
So NFTs is a really, really interesting topic. There are people who've drunk the Kool-Aid who totally believe that they're the future of the art market. And they are a future not just of the art market, but of how to sell, to prove ownership of something digital. Because until now, we didn't have that problem. Something was physical. You could move it around and you could say, this is mine, and you could show it. But how do you prove ownership and as a result trade something digital? So I think NFTs have a very interesting future, and for artists because you can bake in royalties as well. So they get a small amount every time it's resold. I think at the moment the market for NFTs is wildly overvalued, and I think this is a bubble and it will calm down, but it doesn't mean that NFTs will go away. I think they are here to stay, but not as they are at present.
I totally agree. How much of the art market is about money and how much is really about the art today? We talked about it, but I mean...
Yes, I'm quite saddened by the fact that art has become such an investment product. But I do like to remind everyone, your listeners, my listeners, that it's not all of the art market. And in fact, not all art is a good investment. Let's not forget that if you go and buy something at a lowish price, say a few $1,000s, which is already quite a lot of money for a lot of people, you may never be able to resell it for that price. So it is a bit of there was an economist who wrote something called Art as a Floating Crap Game. Crap being a card game in America. It's difficult to predict. You may be lucky and buy an artist if you've got a good eye, and if you're lucky you may get an artist whose prices go up radically, but you may not.
Are you yourself colored by the fact when you're looking at art? I mean, can you see the beauty of it, or do you always have the kind of second opinion from a financial perspective? Do you understand what I mean?
When I look at art, I don't think about the price of it. I look to see whether I think it's successful as an artwork.
Yeah.
I'm rather saddened as well, but I think a lot of art today has lost the aesthetic side. It's no longer beautiful. It might be made with very fine sentiments, and it may comment on things that are very important today, like climate change. But if you just have to read text after text after text and there's no actual artwork there, or the artwork is a series of texts, I think that's a pity, because I think artists are here to bring beauty into our lives as well. That's a bit of an old-fashioned point of view, I realise.
That's okay. A few years ago, I met a person who told me that the world has had more new museums in the first 20 years of our century than in the entire 19th and 20th century. Is it true?
I don't know that it's absolutely true. I mean, in the sense that I haven't verified those figures and they would be very difficult to verify, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. I would have thought that is true.
But the ownership of many other museums also looks different today. Today many other museums are privately owned, while the former museum were public institutions. What are the biggest differences?
I think the biggest difference is the aim of the museum. A private museum ultimately, in the case of a private individual, is his collection that he's put on show, or her collection that she's put on show, because there's a lot of very significant women in this. A public institution has got different aims, because it's not just showing one person's taste and one person's choices, but it's giving a curatorial side to it, an aesthetic side. It's sort of showing whatever its aim is. It's showing the art history. It's not a question of taste. It's more of a scientific endeavor. They're doing research, they're doing conservation, they're doing curation. So I think their aims are different. And of course, because they're publicly funded, they have to reflect a broader diversity of tastes. A curator may not particularly like work from, say, Latin America, but they will have Latin American works because that's what their mission is. A private museum, the private museum owner is free to do whatever he likes, and if he doesn't like Latin American works, he won't have any. That's his right. He's paying for his museum.
But also when it comes to public institution, isn't it that a public institution needs to have about at least 3,000 3 to 4,000 items in the collection to call itself a museum? What about the private museums?
Well, the private museum can be somebody's collection in their home, and I've been to a couple. And that's fine, as long as you know what it is and he opens it to the public, he or she, and you can see what they've collected. So that's fine. Whereas a state-funded museum obviously doesn't have that mission. Although it's always difficult to generalise. For example, we have here in London Sir John Soane's Museum, which is just the collection of this person which was given, and it's like that. That's what it is, and it's interesting because it's in the house that it was made, that it was collected in. But on the whole, yes, the mission of a publicly funded museum is different.
In many museums around the world, you see rooms and works with donation signs. Nowadays, many people put the name on the entire museum, or in some cases, such as the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris, for example, a brand that can triumph in museums. Is it a way for people to immortalize themselves, or is it about building a brand?
So you've got to distinguish corporate museums like Vuitton, or the one that François Pinault has built, or Italy has quite a few, and they are definitely, I'm thinking of the Prada Museum, they're branding exercises, they're very good museums. And interestingly, somebody who I quote in the book said, the museums have got to be very high quality because they're reflecting a luxury goods brand. And that's important. Sure. Because you've got this brand in front of the public 365 days a year, not just when you're seeing Vuitton clothes or handbags during, for example, a catwalk. So that happens once or twice or 3 times a year, whereas now you've got that brand. So that's branding. But I can't remember the first part of your question.
No. Me neither.
What was the first part? It was something about...
No, but is it a way for people legacy. To immortalize themselves?
Yes. So I think that motivations, and this is a terribly interesting subject and something that I go into in a whole chapter in the book, motivations vary, and generally there's not a single motivation. People, possibly they come from a poor background, they've done well, they want to show what they've collected. They want often to give back to their community, because particularly in countries that don't have many contemporary art museums, it's a platform for local artists. I mean, if you look at the Samdanis in Bangladesh, Bangladesh can't possibly afford a contemporary art museum, so they're stepping in. There's that. But there's a desire to leave your name. I mean, after all, we talk about the great collectors of the past, the Carnegies, the Mellons and so on. Their name lives on.
I was at the Wallace collection yesterday.
The Wallace, yes, their name lives on through their good works. So there's really, in a way, nothing wrong with that. And then there is self-aggrandizement, and that can also drift off into something that's even less good, which is also increasing the value of the works of art that you've bought by putting them in a lovely museum. And one of the approaches, and somebody who writes about the Eli Broad's museum, the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, somebody said, well, it's just a museum of auction house trophies. So so you see it can go from really good motivations through to something that's really not as good.
China and Asia has been important superpower for the art and auction industry the last 2 decades. Are they also dominate when it comes to where in the world those museums are established? You actually kind of answered that question already. But is that because of the new economy?
So China is an interesting case because the Chinese are playing catch up with the West. They know that there are so many museums per head of population in the West, and they want to have as many. And so that's why they're building. But also in China there is this aspect that art is soft power. Art is seen as something positive. And so they actually back even exhibitions, say, of Chinese ink paintings that are held in other countries. They will help finance it because this gives a good face to China, and they feel that it undoes the negative face that we get, for example, their dreadful treatment of the Uyghur Muslims, which is atrocious, and they're trying to balance out with this soft power, cultural power, trying to block out the negative aspects of the way we look at China.
It's not the first time when you use art in that way, I would say.
Yes, not art washing.
But what about also the high prices that are on the art and auction market today? Does that leave the traditional public institutions away from the market because it's too expensive?
This is a real problem. And this is where I think one of the very negative things about private museums is that because they belong to billionaires generally, they can outbid the public sector completely. And so they can buy, I mean, can you imagine a Jeff Koons at $91 million? What public institution could possibly pay that price? Or indeed, would the public like them to devote so much money to a single work of art? So I think this is a real problem, is that they've outbid. But you can look at it in another way and also say, well, thanks to Eli Broad, the Broad, you can go and see a Jeff Koons on public show for free in his museum, which you can't in a private museum, which you can't in a state museum. So, you can argue that both ways.
But there is another problem, of course, also because the insurance premiums are getting higher for the museums. It's very hard to loan the artworks from another museum if they're worth billions and billions, of course.
Well, in the UK we have a government indemnity scheme. So things that are sent from a public institution or from a public museum, they are covered by the government, so they don't have to pay the insurance premiums. So that is more of a problem within the private sector.
Okay.
I don't know for other countries.
Will these museums survive a couple of generations? Because, I mean, there is a financial coverage for new purchases, maintenance, or properties and stuff, maybe for 50, maybe for 100 years, but what happened then?
I think you're optimistic saying 50 or 100 years.
Me too.
Because I don't think, and I think this is a major problem that people haven't really thought about enough, and that museum owners don't think about either. Sustainability and the legacy. You've put your collection on show in a building. When you pass on, will your children be interested? Or even if you've left an endowment, which often is not the case, but if you have left an endowment, Eli Broad left 200 million. One Koons is almost 100 million. So what is in the future, is that money going to be able to support that level of acquisitions? So I think a lot of museums are going to disappear, and indeed I write about in the book quite a few museums that have already closed, because they just can't be, once the drive, the passion, the interest of the founder goes, it's very difficult for somebody else to pick up those reins and continue on. So I think that, as I say, I think even 50 years is optimistic for a lot of them. I think they will gradually wither with their founders. There'll be a few exceptional cases, I think probably the state will have to acquire some of them.
Might be the future for the auction houses then.
Well, the question is, since we've got this phenomenon that's a very recent phenomenon, these museum collectors, quite a few of them are going to tend to die within a reasonably short period, say within 20 years of each other. If the children want to sell, it means, and what have they acquired? They've acquired 20th and 21st century art. I think personally there's going to be a bit of a glut coming on the market, or it'll be offered to public institutions who won't want it necessarily.
Interesting. So, what does your collective experience say about the future?
I think at the moment, for the art market, the future is reasonably rosy in the sense that we are looking at a lot of very cheap money. We are looking at rising inflation, and I think the fact that the top end of the art market is seen as quite safe, I think the top end will be fine, it'll do well. And the number of billionaires in the world has increased enormously. The disparity of wealth is another subject and very shocking, but it exists. I think there's more danger at the mid-level, where I think that people are being priced out. I think that the speculation on young artists, particularly young artists of colour, particularly young women artists of colour, has taken prices that are not sustainable longer term. So I think that that could be problematic. But I'm reasonably optimistic about the art market because I think that also art has become much more of everyday life than it used to be. Even taxi drivers know quite a lot, surprising amount about, okay, the ones that hit the headlines. They know about, here in England, Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin. They know about Koons. There's a lot of public art commissions that are done, people see them. Even in magazines, pop shows, for example, Jeff Koons' Balloon Dog was used as the backdrop of, I think it was Jay-Z, one of his concerts. It was Kanye West or Jay-Z, but I think it was Jay-Z. So I think there's more awareness of art, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, you see it in the fashion industry and everywhere.
Totally,
right
yes,
now.
everywhere. Magazines, fashion, you know. Shops, look at them, these overlaps when you have art that's shown in a shop at the same time as their goods. I think it's a bit dangerous as well, because the danger is that art is seen as a luxury product, and it's more than a luxury. It's not just a luxury product. Good art carries with it as well as symbolic value and aesthetic value. Some artworks have been incredibly important, even politically, like Guernica, which of course a Vuitton handbag doesn't carry with it.